So I see a lot of questions from people new to Flutter about stateful widgets, what they are, trying to understand them, and trying to understand how to use them in their code. I'm going to try to explain once and for all what a stateful widget is and how to use it for people who are new to Flutter and new to the concept. How do I know what I'm talking about? Well, I'm the primary author of an open source library called Rapido, which brings rapid application development to Flutter. So if you are interested in accelerating the time it takes for you to add features to your application, I'll have all these links below. Please come and check out the links. Follow us on Twitter. Give us a star on GitHub so you can follow us. Okay, so let's talk though about stateful widgets. Before we do that, I would like to quickly contrast the stateful widget with a stateless widget. Okay, so the key thing about a stateless widget is that once it's created, it cannot be updated. It can't update itself, and its parents can't update it. If you want to update what's displayed in the stateless widget, then you have the parent of that stateless widget has to destroy the old stateless widget and create a new instance of the stateless widget with the new data. This is in contrast to a stateful widget, which maintains state, which means that the stateful widget can rebuild itself without the parent having to rebuild it. It can update itself. Okay, so what we'll look at is how that works. Okay, I'm going to go over the parts of a stateful widget here, and then we'll go over them in more detail in code in a minute. So the first part is a class that extends stateful widget. Okay, so it's the stateful widget subclass. And that stateful widget subclass has immutable properties, which is a little bit confusing because it's a stateful widget. How could it have immutable properties? I'll explain that in a moment. The second part is it has typically a constructor to set those immutable properties. And then there's a required call to create state. Create state results in a state object that is mutable. So that's the mutable part of the stateful widget, is the stateful widget state. So that's the second part, is a class to extend state, a subclass of state. But it's important to note that state is templated with your subclass of the stateful widget. And you'll see that in code, and you'll see why that's important. Now, the state's properties can be mutable, and they're typically mutable. That's the point, is to be able to change those properties to maintain the state. Optionally, you can call init state, which is to initialize the state at first run. But then you'll typically have at least one call to set state that gets called in order to update the state of the object. And that you'll see why that's important. And then, of course, there's a build method to return the actual widget tree that's part of the stateful widget. Okay, this will be a little clearer, I think, when we get to code. So let's look at some code. So first, here's the first part, is a class that extends stateful widget. So I'm calling it example stateful widget class. And again, the first value here, the first property is an immutable property called initial value. And that makes sense that that initial value is immutable, right? Like, how could you change the initial value? It's the initial value. There can only ever be one initial value. So that makes sense that that's immutable. And then, of course, there's a constructor here where we use this nice start syntax where I can create a named parameter to initialize that initial value. And then there's the call to create state. And this is important because this is the part of the stateful widget that can change. It's state, right? The state changes. So notice that it's returning a example stateful widget state. Okay, so this is the second part of the stateful widget, is the state itself. It's the state itself. It extends the state, and specifically, it extends state templatized with the class name, the subclass of stateful widget, right? That's why you might notice that example stateful widget starts with an underscore. That makes this private within this module. Like the idea there is that only the example stateful widget will ever need to know about example stateful widget states. So you should make that private. You do that with the underscore. Okay, now here there's a property called current value. And of course that is mutable. Notice that is not set with final. Current value can change. Okay, then there's some boilerplate here. If you want to set an initial state, you can call init state. Init state in the state subclass only gets called when that object is created. So it only gets called once. And then there's the call to set state, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. And then finally, of course, there's a build method, which needs to return a widget tree. So just to get it started, all I'm returning is a container, is an empty container. Okay, so now let's build out the widget a little bit and make it do something a little more interesting. Let's let it use these parts. Okay, so what I'm doing here first is in the init state, I'm setting the current value to the initial value. Now notice how I'm doing that with the widget dot. So it's widget dot initial value. The reason that works is because when I declared my class, I extended state, but I extended it templatized with example stateful widget. So therefore, it has a widget property, which it knows is of this type, and so then it can find that it's got an initial value. So that's why it's very important that this is templatized. Okay, and then here all I'm doing is creating a text object where I'm just displaying the current value. And now here is just the boilerplate for the code in my main.dart file, and you can see it just calls the example stateful widget, and I'm setting its initial value to 0. Obviously, I can set that to whatever I want. This is how I use the example stateful widget in a parent. Okay, so when I run the code, you can see it works. Passed in 0, and it shows 0. But now we need to make it dynamic. Since that current value is mutable, we need some way to update it to do something interesting. So what I did here was I added an icon button to the widget. And then on pressed, I called current value plus plus. Okay, so on pressed, current value plus plus. But the UI is rendered, no matter how many times I press this plus button, the 0 is never going to get updated. It's never going to get updated unless something above the stateful widget causes it to rebuild. But generally speaking, it's never going to get updated. It's not going to get updated in the way I mean to. And the reason is because I did not call set state. Okay, so if I wrap that current value increment in set state, this tells the stateful widget, hey, I'm going to increment current value plus plus, or I'm going to do whatever operations I'm going to do in here. And then when that's done, you need to rebuild yourself. Okay, so that's the key part. Set state tells the state to call the build method again with whatever are the new values that are set and rebuild itself. And then, however many times I press this plus button, it'll work. Okay, so I hope that helps clarify how to build your own stateful widgets. If you have any questions, if there's anything I could explain better, just go ahead and ask in the comments, or you can go ahead and ask in GitHub, or you can ask on Twitter. But hopefully this helps clarify.